Good evening. It's November 13th, 2015. My name is Matthew Ogden, and you're watching our weekly Friday evening webcast here from LaRouchepack.com. I'm joined in the studio tonight by Jeffrey Steinberg from Executive Intelligence Review. Now, obviously, we are meeting here tonight under very solemn and horrifying conditions as we are hearing reports that over 100 people have died in what seem to be terrorist attacks across Paris. The entire nation of France is currently under a state of emergency, and obviously details of these attacks are still coming in as this is an ongoing situation. I know Jeff will have something to say later on this subject, later on this evening during this broadcast as pertains to these horrific events. But this evening we're going to be beginning our broadcast with an on-the-ground video report from New York City, where the LaRouche Political Action Committee held a rally earlier today in front of the headquarters of the New York Times. I'm sure many of our viewers have had a chance to see on the front page of the LaRouche Pack website a press release which was published on this website yesterday, which is titled, "Why Won't the New York Times Publish Obama's Drone Papers?" which makes the point that despite the fact that the Times played a central role back in 1971 in publishing the so-called Pentagon Papers, which were revealed by Daniel Ellsberg and were released to the American people by the courageous actions which Senator Mike Gravel took by reading them into the congressional record. Despite the fact that the Times was instrumental in this action, which was instrumental in laying the foundation for the downfall of Richard Nixon and the ultimate end of the Vietnam War. Today, the New York Times has made the willful choice not to publish any serious coverage of the so-called drone papers, which were likewise leaked by a courageous whistleblower from within the drone program itself, a so-called second Edward Snowden, and published by Glenn Greenwald's internet-based publication, The Intercept. Despite thoroughly damning new details that have emerged and are contained within these documents, the drone papers, which pull back the curtain on the murderous and completely out of control targeted assassination program that's being run top-down by President Barack Obama in his weekly kill sessions without any due oversight and from behind closed doors. Despite this, the editors of the New York Times have publicly stated that, in their opinion, these new revelations do not, quote, warrant their own story. The truth is, and you can be assured that the New York Times editorial staff well knows this, any widespread and serious coverage of the drone papers today by a major national newspaper of record, such as the New York Times, in the fashion of the Times' own coverage of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, would have an utterly devastating effect on revealing to the American people the true reality of how this secret drone program is actually run and the character of the president who runs it. And just as the Pentagon Papers did back then, a major publication of the drone papers today would likewise lay the foundation for the indictment and political downfall of this president, as his murderous proclivities are put on full display for the entire country to see. The question is, knowing all of this, as the press release puts it, quote, is the New York Times more afraid of Barack Obama than it was of Richard Nixon? And will that fear of taking on the true characteristic of what this president stands for cause the New York Times to fail to address that awful reality at the very time that Obama is leading the United States into unprecedented war provocations against both Russia and China, and by failing to do so, thus finding themselves, the New York Times, complicit in actions which threaten the outbreak of a third world war and endanger the continued existence of all mankind. So, with that said, as an opening statement, we bring you the on-the-ground report from New York City delivered by LaRouche PAC's Daniel Burke.
Hi, I'm Daniel Burke, and this is a LaRouche Political Action Committee rally that you're witness to at the moment in front of the New York Times headquarters on 41st Street and 8th Avenue. And we stand here today in the midst of certainly the gravest crisis that our species has ever faced, which is well expressed in this banner that we have before us. Obama leads America to hell. But our mission is to unify the United States, to have the courage to stand up against the insanity that is dominating our government today. At the moment, we are on the brink of a thermonuclear war because of the fact that this man has been tolerated. And his provocations against Russia and against China are unprecedented in the history of humanity in terms of the danger that they pose. But as we've laid out in a webcast over the recent weeks, there is a clear train of abuses. The evidence is before you, and now it's a matter of having the courage to stand up against it. So that's what we're doing today, because the fact of the matter is that the New York Times has been covering up for Obama's satanic drone murders. It's been released through The Intercept from a new whistleblower, as we've documented in our webcast so far, that Obama is at the top of a chain that is mass murdering civilians. And the New York Times buried this comment, the release of these documents, at the bottom of a column a couple of weeks ago. And then they justified this by claiming that it did not warrant its own story. So we stand here to specifically indicate the editors, the writers who were involved in this cover-up, demand that this be brought to justice effectively. And in the meanwhile, to consider that what we need today is for one senator to stand up and to move against Obama. This is what happened with Richard Nixon. And it was in that case that the New York Times had the courage in 1971 to publish the Pentagon Papers. Why will they remain silent on these satanic murders from Barack Obama?
Now, Mr. LaRouche wanted to feature this video report from New York City for the reason that he has placed Manhattan at the center of his strategy to restore the United States to its original founding principle as embodied in Alexander Hamilton, the very opposite of everything that Obama has come to represent today. Further coverage of this rally will be available on the LaRouche PAC website, including a longer version of this on-the-ground report, as well as the text of the press release, which I mentioned at the outset of tonight's proceedings. But when you place Obama's drone program in the context of his open and blatant war provocations against both Russia and now increasingly against China in the recent days and weeks, which will lead to a global thermonuclear war if not stopped. In that context, I would like to ask Jeff to elaborate a little bit on what Mr. LaRouche's assessment was of the importance of using this campaign, as you just saw, centered in Manhattan around the revelations that are now contained and released in the drone papers, so-called, in order to drive Obama from office before he has the chance to lead the world into World War III.
I learned earlier today that there is a joke circulating very widely in Israel, and I'm sure in other places around the world, and the joke goes something like this. What's the difference between God and Barack Obama? The answer? God doesn't think he's Barack Obama. What we're dealing with here is truly a satanic personality. And yet he's been permitted to carry out atrocity after atrocity, all on behalf of the British, whose policy at the level of the British Empire, at the level of the British monarchy, has been always one of massive population reduction through policies of genocide. I think that's the way you've got to understand the events that are unfolding right now in Paris. In a very real sense, the slaughter that's taken place over the last few hours, and of course French authorities are not sure that it's over. There were 7 attacks against 7 different random targeted popular night spots all around the city of Paris, highly coordinated, kind of what we saw in 2008 in Mumbai, but on a much more elaborate scale. And you've got to ask yourself, where does this kind of satanic behavior come from? What are the roots of this Islamic State jihadist apparatus? Well, remember that the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Michael Flynn, warned earlier this year in a now widely circulated interview with Al Jazeera America that he had gone to President Obama in the summer of 2012 and warned that the policies that the U.S. was pursuing, particularly the policies of facilitating the running of heavy weapons from the Libyan port city of Benghazi into various Syrian rebel groups, was going to result in the creation of a jihadist caliphate on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean and in that general Middle Eastern region. Now, this was 2 years prior to the formal surfacing of the Islamic State, which really launched its operations in Iraq with the dramatic takeover of Mosul, and that was in June of 2014. So you've got high-level U.S. defense intelligence officials telling the President of the United States, drop your fixation with the overthrow of the Assad government in Syria. Halt the flow of weapons that were unleashed on the world as the result of the overthrow of Gaddafi and his instant execution back in the fall of 2011, which unleashed floods of weapons throughout Africa and through this Benghazi operation of British intelligence and John Brennan as the counterintelligence director of the Obama administration. The weapons flow began into Syria, and these weapons went into the hands of the very jihadist networks that we've now seen operating on the streets of Paris. So, is there a causal relationship between the British satanic policies of mass population reduction, often stated by Prince Philip, the royal consort, who insists that the world's population must be reduced by 80%? The fact that General Flynn openly said that President Obama did not ignore the warnings, but pursued a willful policy of continuing with the arming of the Syrian rebels after he was repeatedly told what the consequences of that would be. And now we've seen those consequences with the establishment of the Islamic State. We've seen those events now spilling over into the streets of Paris. The situation in France is still unfolding. There's no definitive answers yet in terms of who particularly carried out these heinous attacks. But we know that the circumstances under which those kinds of events could happen were the product of a persistent line of policy that has come out of the presidency of the United States for at least the last 15 years. The 8 years of Bush and Cheney, and now the 7+ years of Barack Obama. So you're dealing with somebody who is, by his character, pursuing outright policies that are evil, that are satanic, and that at their core are British, that directly go to the demands of the Prince Philips of the world, who call for mass population reduction. Now, we know that in 2 weeks, the COP21 climate change conference is scheduled to happen in Paris. We may very well find that there was a relationship between these attacks that we're now just seeing unfolding on the streets of Paris right now and that upcoming conference. Earlier this week, Secretary of State John Kerry bluntly stated what's now become obvious, namely that COP21 conference, despite the efforts of the papal encyclical and John Schellenhuber and other outright proponents of genocide, that conference is likely to fail. There's too much resistance from developing sector countries that realize that what they're looking at is a recipe for genocide. So what we have before us then are other means by which the world is careening towards the kinds of events that can lead to the mass population reduction policies that are being demanded principally out of the British monarchy and are being carried out principally through agents of that monarchy, such as Barack Obama. So what have we seen just in the recent days? The administration has continued with the drone kill policy. And as we saw in the rally out in front of the New York Times, it's quite clear that the White House has put enormous pressure on the major U.S. media outlets to suppress the story. Because the story, were it to get national media attention through the New York Times, through the Washington Post, through CNN, or one of the major cable news outlets, there would be a groundswell of demand for President Obama's removal from office. These policies are policies of outright genocide. And we've been continuing our own investigation into the drone kill policy of Obama, looking beyond the drone papers that were released by The Intercept about 3-4 weeks ago. And when you dig deeper into this policy, what you find is that there have been repeated and consistent studies carried out by the military, carried out by major think tanks whose job it is to do analysis of the actions of the military. You had the Stimson Center producing a series of 2 reports in 2012 and in 2014. The Naval Postgraduate School out in Monterey, California, produced a major study. The RAND Corporation produced a major study. In every instance, they came to the identical conclusion. The drone policy is a failed policy. It can never work. It will never work. The idea of targeting priority terrorist agents for elimination does nothing to reduce the spread of these kinds of jihadists. If anything, it becomes a major means of further recruitment, of expansion of operations. These are not things that are unknown at the levels of the National Security Council, the Obama White House, and similar locations. It is willfully known that these policies do not curb terrorism, do not defeat insurgent movements. They feed them, they fuel them, they expand them. And so you really do have a principle here in which the objective is not to defeat terrorism, but the objective is to spread the kind of murderous chaos that we've seen in Gulf Syria for the last 4.5 years, that we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan going back to the beginning of the Bush-Cheney administration in 2001, with the aftermath of the 9/11 events that have been systematically covered up, first by President Bush, now by President Obama. The real issue here is not exposing the role of the Saudis in this kind of sponsorship of terrorism, including the 9/11 attacks. The real issue here is that there is a conscious policy of creating conditions of global instability and chaos that ensure that the targeted population reduction goals are being met. And war is still one of the major means for that to be carried out. So we have a period that we've been living through that constitutes more than a 30 years war, a period of perpetual war. And these last two presidencies have been major instrumentalities to make sure that that policy happens. Now, in the past days, in addition to the continuing cover-up of the Obama drone kill programs, which go directly and personally to Obama's desk in the Oval Office, every single one of these kill orders has Barack Obama's personal signature on it. And former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, when he was asked to comment about the drone program, simply said, "It's the only game in town." So this has been the signature policy, an indiscriminate mass murder policy of this president and of this administration. And the idea of toleration for that for one moment more is something that now clearly threatens us all. If these kinds of actions can happen in the streets of Paris, France, then they can happen anywhere, including here in the United States. Now, not only is Obama continuing to pursue and defend this policy of drone kill, but in the past week we've seen an escalation on the strategic scale as well. The Defense Secretary Ash Carter spent last week in Asia attending the ASEAN Defense Ministers Conference, and he tried to turn that event, unsuccessfully fortunately, into a gang-up against China. The host government, Malaysia, refused to include a reference to the South China Sea situation in the draft communique for that conference. Carter showed up, and by the way, the United States is not a member of ASEAN. Carter was there as an invited guest of the ASEAN countries, the 10 nations of Southeast Asia. But he basically intervened to try to hijack the entire direction of that conference. And fortunately, many of those countries of the region simply refused to do it. As the result, the conference ended in a shambles. There was no final communique. And from Kuala Lumpur, Carter returned to the United States via Simi Valley, California, where he gave a major speech at the Reagan Library and assailed both Russia and China and accused them of saber-rattling around the threat of nuclear war. And what he was referring to in the specific case of Russia is that Russia, in response to the United States' deployment of ABM systems right along the southern borders of Russia, the expansion of NATO throughout Eastern Europe, in violation of the agreements that were reached at the time of German reunification. In response to all of those provocations, the Russians have moved to establish new levels of defense against what President Putin this week described as a clear attempt by the U.S. and its allies to break up the strategic balance that had existed throughout the period of the Cold War and the post-Cold War period up until this time, and that the United States, by refusing to collaborate with Russia on some kind of global missile defense program, as President Reagan had proposed back in 1983 when he was in close collaboration with Lyndon LaRouche on that project. The United States policy is to create a thermonuclear war-winning option. And that poses not just an existential threat to Russia, but a grave threat to all of mankind. Now, middle of this past week, President Putin convened the annual meeting with top Russian defense officials and leaders of the defense industrial sector of Russia at Sochi on the Black Sea. And in opening remarks to that event, which were widely televised throughout Russia, Putin made very clear the United States has been targeting Russia with the ABM deployment. The fact is clearly demonstrated because even after the P5+1 deal was reached with Iran, the United States announced it was continuing to move full steam ahead with the ABM deployment, not in partnership with Russia, but unilaterally with U.S. allies. And since the original argument had been made that this ABM system was strictly directed against Iran, now that Iran has come into compliance with the nuclear deal with the P5+1, it just shows the lie to everything that Obama has been saying on this. Putin made very clear that Russia is moving forward to develop new weapon systems that can defeat any kind of ABM program that the U.S. puts in place, which will be directed against Russia. At the same time, as reported this week in The Guardian, we've mentioned it here on these Friday night webcasts for some time, the United States is going ahead with the deployment of what is in effect a new generation of tactical nuclear weapons that will be forward-based in Central and Eastern and Western Europe, and which will be a new generation. They're called the B-6112, with highly accurate tail guidance systems that will penetrate deeper into Russian territory with much more precision accuracy, and therefore these nuclear weapons will have greatly reduced thermonuclear payloads, which means that the gap between strategic nuclear war and tactical theater conventional nuclear war is greatly reduced. In other words, we're moving towards a policy of having a deployable force of thermonuclear weapons directed at close range against targets in Russia. Now, we learned this past week through excerpts from a forthcoming authorized biography of George Herbert Walker Bush that at the time of the 1991 Operation Desert Storm, and again during 2003, during the period of the invasion and overthrow of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Dick Cheney was persistently pushing for the use of nuclear weapons. In the case of the first war in the Gulf, Cheney was promoting the idea that the U.S. should use 17 tactical nuclear weapons against targets in Iraq. So now we've got a continuation of that policy under President Obama. So here we are, more than 25 years after the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. We're facing the gravest threat of thermonuclear war, not because of any actions on the part of Russia, but because of the character of the President of the United States, a satanic character who has no sense whatsoever of the consequences of pursuing this kind of policy of genocide. So whether it's preparing the groundwork for thermonuclear confrontation with Russia, and similarly with China, we've had B-52 bombers, which are bombers that are capable of carrying thermonuclear warheads, flying over territory that China claims in the South China Sea as China's sovereign territory as part of the Spratly Islands. That happened just in the last several days, and it's only now been first acknowledged by the Pentagon. There was an earlier incident involving naval ships incursions into those same waters. So we've got the targeting of Russia, the beginnings of a similar outright targeting of China. We have the drone policy and the cover-up of that policy. So here we are literally looking at somebody whose track record, documented, proven track record, is that of mass murder. And yet there is toleration for his remaining in office. Now, in our discussion this afternoon with Mr. LaRouche, he very much placed the emphasis on the situation in Manhattan. You've got a unique characteristic of the population of Manhattan, the population of New York City and the greater metropolitan area, but particularly the population of Manhattan. They still have a greater sense of reality, at least large segments of the population do. They have a greater sense of the morality that goes with recognizing the grave danger that we're facing in the world today. And so, if you look back historically, Manhattan was the place where the core concepts around which our constitutional republic was organized were formulated. They were formulated in Manhattan in particular by our first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. There is a Hamiltonian tradition that prevails, and that tradition is the organizing principle for our nation, for our republic. So Manhattan holds a special place for the nation as a whole. Mr. LaRouche pointed out that if you do a survey region by region around the United States, you will find that region by region, the economy has been destroyed. The social fabric has been gutted. We have drug addiction, suicides, all kinds of social dislocation because region by region, the economies of these areas of the United States have been gutted, particularly during the period first of the Bush-Cheney administration and at a greater and greater accelerating rate under President Obama. Never mind that since 9/11, $44 billion in your taxpayers' money has gone into the establishment of this drone kill program that is one of the critical factors that keeps expanding the size and brutality of the terrorist apparatus that we've now seen playing out on the streets of Paris just in the last few hours. So we're dealing with an assault against the American people, an assault that has weakened the social fabrics of many parts of our country. So again, Manhattan represents a certain kind of glue, a potential critical point of inspiration for saving this nation. And this event that you've just seen a brief excerpt of in front of the New York Times headquarters today is indicative of the kind of thing that we will be doing at an accelerating and continuing rate of expansion in Manhattan. And we've got a situation in Washington where there are a precious handful of elected officials, people in other positions within the federal government, within the military, within the diplomatic corps, within the intelligence services, a handful of people who remain truly committed to the survival of this nation and the planet. And we call on you, the American people, to put maximum pressure on them to step outside the bounds of what's required to go along to get along, and for a handful of these people to step forward and speak the absolute truth about what has gone on in this country, particularly during the 7 years of this Obama presidency. One or two leading members of the U.S. Senate in particular, taking their oath of office seriously, can bring this president down and start the process of reversal of this destructive, literally satanic takedown of the United States and everything it has historically stood for. We need that step, but we need the voice of the American people, led by Manhattan, to make sure that that actually happens and that it happens in time.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff's comments actually just now regarding the events which occurred in Paris this evening prompted me to recall the remarks that former Senator Bob Graham made at a press conference on Capitol Hill on January 6th of this year, which was merely hours after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, also in Paris. And in that press conference, former Senator Bob Graham laid the responsibility right at the doorstep of President Obama and put the fault right on Obama's doorstep because of his refusal to end the cover-up of the 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission or of the 9/11 Joint Inquiry Report. And as Jeff just said, this indictment of Obama's fault on this matter obviously still applies. And Bob Graham at that press conference called for a Lincoln-esque standard of full disclosure of the contents of the 28 pages in that count, but also this obviously applies to the drone papers and all the other crimes that remain in the shadows. Bob Graham was referring to Abraham Lincoln's full disclosure of the role of the British in supporting the Confederacy during the Civil War. And what Senator Graham said at that time was the national security threat lies not in the disclosure of these documents, but in the non-disclosure, as could be seen then in the case of the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, and I believe as can be seen again today in the continuing attacks in Paris. Also, I would say the 28 pages warrant the Pentagon Papers treatment by some courageous member of the United States Senate or U.S. House. Now, with that said, we have a question which has come in from our institutional source, and I'm going to read it. It's very brief, and I'm going to ask Jeff to respond. It reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, what are your thoughts on the immigration crises in Europe, and what is your advice to European leaders?
Mr. LaRouche's answer to this question was very brief and very blunt. He said, the first step towards solving this problem is that Wolfgang Schäuble, the finance minister of Germany, has got to be dumped. Schäuble, in Mr. LaRouche's words, belongs to be put in a pig pen because his ideas and his opinions stink. He's terrible. He's disgusting, and he personifies those in Europe who are trying to stir up this refugee crisis into a showdown, a kind of a confrontation that could ultimately lead to the eruption of an outright civil war in Europe. In fact, I greatly fear that in the wake of these Paris attacks, that you're going to see an enormous backlash. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who is increasingly becoming a captive of the revolt by people like Schäuble in her own party, actually took the surprising but courageous stance of saying that these refugees must be assisted, they must be protected, and they must be given an opportunity to be integrated into European society. And so there's a deep split over this issue. The Russians, through President Putin, have intervened forcefully into the Syria situation to bring the Syria war to an end. The Russian military intervention on behalf of the Assad government is beginning to show significant success. Remember that the Russian involvement only began directly on the 30th of September. So we're talking about a period of 6 weeks. And in that six-week period, there has been a number of significant setbacks delivered to the Islamic State and some of the other jihadist elements of the Syrian rebel opposition. The area around the city of Aleppo, which is the industrial capital of Syria, is now in the process of being retaken by the government forces. 60 to 80% of the population of Syria has now moved or has already been located in areas under government protection. So the idea that the Syrian people are fleeing to Europe through Turkey and other routes to get away from Assad is not the reality of the situation. They're fleeing to get away from the Islamic State, the Nusra Front, and the jihadists who've been the instruments for the war to overthrow the Assad government. Remember, in August of 2009, President Obama simply declared Assad must go. And with that declaration, the U.S. began facilitating the efforts of the Saudis, the Turks, and others to provide weapons to an army of jihadists who've come in from around the world. So defeat the Islamic State, push back against the tyranny of the Anglo-Saudi apparatus, dump the likes of Wolfgang Schäuble and others of his ilk who are trying to stir up literally a Hitlerian backlash in Europe against these refugees who are caught in a trap between the brutality of ISIS back in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria, and the emergence of a nativist right wing, literally a Hitlerian backlash inside Western Europe. If Europe is to survive, if Syria is to be rebuilt, then you've got to take certain decisive actions, and the United States should be collaborating with Russia in a coordinated effort to defeat ISIS. Because every effort that the U.S. and this so-called coalition of 60 nations has taken against ISIS has been a completely transparent fraud. So who's responsible for the flood of refugees streaming into Europe? Start with President Obama, British Prime Minister Cameron, former French President Sarkozy, current French President Hollande. These are the criminals who, along with the Saudis, the Turks, the Qataris, and the others, have been providing all of the logistical and other support to the spread of this jihadism, because ultimately what they're out to accomplish is a population war. We've said this previously. The British policy towards the entire Islamic world is to foment a new religious 100 years war between Sunni and Shia on a global scale, because ultimately their objective is population reduction. If they can launch such a 100 years war, then how many of the 1.8 or so billion Muslims on this planet will survive at the end of the day? And again, we have a president of the United States who, by personality and by ownership by the British, is a fully winning instrument in this process. So on the one hand, as Mr. LaRouche said, Schäuble and people of his ilk have got to be dumped. They're the menace. They're the danger. Schäuble wants to go ahead with murderous austerity against the population of Europe and has even less interest in doing anything for these refugees. And Obama, in his own right, has carried out the same kinds of policies. The destruction of the United States on his watch and on the watch of the previous president is a crime beyond imagination. And so it's time for the American people and even a handful of leading elected officials in Washington to wake up to exactly where the clock stands and to act before midnight.
Well, with that said, I think this is the point where we are going to bring a conclusion to our broadcast tonight. Again, I would recommend people go on the website and watch the full coverage of the rally in front of the New York Times headquarters today in New York City, as well as reading the full text of the press release that was circulated en masse there today. Thank you for joining us, and please stay tuned. And please, if you are in the New York City area, participate in the weekly discussion which Mr. LaRouche holds every Saturday afternoon with the citizens of Manhattan. If you're not, you have the opportunity to do the same on Thursday nights with the weekly fireside chats. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and please stay tuned to LaRouchePAC.com.